Okay, first the coastal plains. So the coastal plains, especially on the Mediterranean, all along here, as you can see, are a lot like Greece, Italy, some of these other places that are on the Mediterranean as well. They're semi-dry, right, but wet enough to have agriculture. In fact, some of the areas can be quite humid. I remember driving in Syria, and we were driving through the desert, and then we started to move closer and closer to the coast, and I could just feel the humidity increase, and I could see the hills start to get more and more green. So this was a good area for early hunters and gatherers, as we're going to see. Back in the time after the Ice Age, it was actually even wetter than it is today. So it was even better an area in terms of vegetation back then than it is today. And this is the area, Istanbul is ancient Constantinople is on the not on the Mediterranean, but it's close. It's near the Bosphorus, which connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and Istanbul is a very, very green city. In fact, I've had some people tell me, I have to have confirmation of this, but some people have said that Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, got the idea or the conception of the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz from Istanbul because it was so green. It was covered all over with vegetation. Right? Istanbul is a really interesting city. It spans two continents. Right? Istanbul, located right over here. Let me get back to the map. Right here. Half of Istanbul is on the European continent and half of Istanbul is on the Asian continent. So you can cross back and forth between Europe and Asia. Lots of ferry boats. You can see it's a very developed city. I think it's like 12 million people now or something like that. Economic powerhouse. This is the older part of Istanbul where the Sultan's palace was and where some of the main mosques can still be found. In the mountains, some mountainous areas are very high altitude and you won't get much vegetation. In some areas you will get vegetation like oak trees, cedar trees, maple trees, pine, and fir. Mediterranean coast of Lebanon is famous in ancient times for its cedar trees. The flag of Lebanon today has a cedar tree on it. This is Mount Ararat. This is very eastern Turkey. This is a very famous mountain. Some people believe it was the location for where Noah's Ark rested when the waters subsided. It's sacred to Armenians today. It's very impressive, as you could see. This is in the summer, and the peaks are still capped with snow. Not a lot of vegetation around it, though. In mountainous regions, you will have certain resources like metals and stone. So not too far from Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey is a major source of obsidian. And we're going to look at the trade of obsidian in the ancient world. Obsidian is a black volcanic glass that is extremely sharp, was traded throughout the ancient world because it's very, very useful in making tools. Other mountainous areas, you can see some of the forests over here. Again, a lot more than just desert in the Middle East. High on the Anatolian Plateau is mainly steppe land, right? Steppe land is grassland. So around here, this high altitude area, it's a flat area ringed by mountains on all sides. This is where you'll find ancient Armenian sites. This is the site of Ani, which was the capital of Armenia in the Middle Ages. Right. The Fertile Crescent, again, these semi-arid uplands and foothills. Foothills is the small hills right before you get to the mountains. So sort of slow rolling hills over here Flat plains over here, fed by rainfall. Before you get up into the high mountains where it's not optimal for agriculture. Right? So it's kind of steppe-like grassland. Used to be forests in the Fertile Crescent, but it was cut down, as we're going to see. But typically, oak trees, pistachio trees would grow there. Pistachio trees take a long time to develop. But you have in Turkey and in the Levant, you have age-old, 100-year-old pistachio trees that bear pistachio nuts and are highly prized by the families that own those fields. So the foothills, that Fertile Crescent area, sometimes it's called the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent. When you get a little bit further up into the mountain, it's kind of the more rugged areas, the hilly flanks over here. Right, so you can see what it looks like in this area of northern Mesopotamia, Fertile Crescent area. It used to be forested, mostly agriculture occurring here. You can spot tells very easily because it's pretty flat, and those tells, as we're going to see, stick up out of the ground and are very noticeable. Some of these areas are close to the Tigris and the Euphrates. You can see it's hilly enough, like I said before, that you can't really irrigate very easily, so you will probably depend on rainfall, agriculture. Important city in this area, ancient city, is modern-day name is Diyarbakir. This is a predominantly Kurdish city today in southeast Turkey. And you can see the black basalt medieval walls that are the fortifications around the city. I don't have any confirmation of this, but I know that J.R.R. Tolkien's brother, I believe, was in Mesopotamia in World War I. And I'm convinced, again, although I have no confirmation, that the Black Walls of Mordor might be based on the Black Walls of Diyarbakir. Okay, let's look at the alluvial plains. So we're talking about the area down here in southern Iraq between the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is a low elevation area, so it gets very, very hot there. No topography, extremely flat. When the rivers flood, they flood for miles because it's just a straight shot from the banks to, as far as you can go. There's lots of silt that's deposited by the rivers, which is great for agriculture, but there's almost no rainfall there, and no rainfall in ancient times as well. So when agriculture was practiced in southern Mesopotamia, the only way to do it was with irrigation. Flooding tends to happen at the wrong time of the year, not like the Nile in Egypt, which flooded exactly when you would want to according to the harvest cycle. Flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates actually usually occurs at the wrong time of year, so they had to try to control flooding so it wouldn't destroy their crops. There's a lot of evaporation because it's so hot, but there's also lots of marsh areas. So this is an area where there are lots and lots of marshes. The marshes of southern Iraq are famous because they are a wetland environment where the people who live there have lived in a way of life at least 5,000 years old, if not older, where they can fish, hunt aquatic birds, and also do agriculture in order to make a living. But lots of diverse resources in these marshland, wetland areas, including reeds, right, that were used to build houses with. Right? So the people live in the marshes of Iraq, and the marshes are coming back now slowly after they were drained. Many of them were drained by Saddam Hussein in the late 90s. Many of the marsh areas are returning. The marsh Arabs would take their boats through these different canal systems, hunt and fish, and collect reeds. And it was a great way to make a living. Some people even consider this the original Garden of Eden. Eden is actually a Sumerian term, and really Eden in Sumerian just designates a well-watered area. Okay, then you have desert regions, right? So we're talking about parts of Syria, parts of Iraq over here, parts of Jordan, and parts of Arabia, right? These areas over here are desert. The rain doesn't reach these areas. In ancient times, before the domestication of the camel, some of these areas were not navigable. People couldn't really go all the way from the Levant to Mesopotamia across the desert. They would probably have to hug this Fertile Crescent area to get from one region to another. With the development of camels, it became possible to trade more through these desert regions. But people have been living in the deserts for thousands of years in the Middle East. Some of these desert locations 10,000 years ago were wetter than they are today, so they weren't quite the deserts that they are now. One of the most famous desert oases trading cities that I've been to is a city in Syria called Palmyra. This ancient city was it was an Arab trading city, but it was a mixture of Arab culture and influence from Rome. The queen of Palmyra, Zenobia, rebelled against the Roman Empire, and unfortunately the Romans, I say unfortunately for me, I'm on the side of the Palmyrines, were defeated and the Romans sacked Palmyra. But it was a city in the desert that had a spring that fed agriculture. It's hard to see in this picture. I'll show you some better pictures. But this is where Palmyra is. This is the desert right next to Palmyra. But because it was on a trade route and because it had an oasis, it turned out to be an excellent place for trade, and it grew wealthy through trade. So again, environment presents opportunities and constraints for people. In this case, it presented the people who lived in this oasis with the opportunity to trade and to tax people, to tax caravans as they crisscross the desert, making their way either to the coast or from the coast. Now, the deserts in the Middle East don't look like the Sahara. When you see, the Sahara, it's rolling sand dunes. Only portions of deserts in the Middle East look like that. A lot of desert in the Middle East is flat, rocky, grasses and shrubs, thorny vegetation, as you can see here. This is the Syrian desert. So no big rolling sand dunes. You do get that in some deserts in the Middle East, but a lot of deserts in Jordan, you're going to have rocky formations that look like mesas that I showed you before from that screen capture from Lawrence of Arabia, right? So this is the kind of black desert of Jordan. So you will get this kind of topography and, sand, but you're not going to get that in other desert locations in the Middle East, where it's going to be flat, sun-baked, dry vegetation like so. Right? Okay, so we saw some of the environmental zones. Now, these environmental zones did have an impact on how people developed in those different areas. Certain areas had certain advantages that other areas didn't. And we're going to see that through history. So the environment does have an influence on how things develop. Now let's take a look at how archaeology started and how it changed over time. Archaeology is a discipline in the Near East, studying the Near East. Right? Okay. The early history of archaeology is one of culture history. Right? That is, when archaeology was first done in the 19th century, Europeans who were going to the Middle East didn't know a lot about the ancient cultures there. There was more that was unknown than was known. If they had studied works of Arab scholars, they would have known a little bit more about some of the ancient history, right? But the archaeology as a discipline starts with European explorers connected to the development of colonialism, going to the Middle East. The first archaeologists were not trained as archaeologists because at this point there were no archaeology programs in universities. So they were self-taught. So, for example, an early explorer, Henry Rawlinson, was actually a diplomat, a British diplomat in Iran, modern Iran, in Persia. And he was very good with military codes and ciphers. And he used that experience to actually crack the cuneiform writing system by using a trilingual script in Iran, in Persia, called the Behistun inscription. This inscription was like the Rosetta Stone for the ancient Middle East. This is kind of a fanciful view of Rawlinson trying to copy the inscription, the cuneiform inscription carved in stone on the cliff face. You can see it's a pretty sheer drop there. And he had to copy the cuneiform characters. Now, what was written here was written in three different languages. Akkadian, which is a Semitic language spoken in Mesopotamia. Elamite, which is an ancient language spoken in modern-day Iran, what's now modern-day Iran, and Old Persian. Right? Now, Old Persian was similar enough to modern Persian that if he was able to figure out what some cuneiform characters meant, he might be able to figure out what some of these words actually spelled out. And that's what he was able to do. Like the deciphers of Egyptian hieroglyphs, he looked for characters that repeated over and over. Right? So systems of cuneiform characters that were repeating throughout the text. He guessed correctly that they were the name of the king for who this was dedicated to, which was Darius. Right? So he knew this was an inscription dedicated to Darius. Within one of the inscriptions or series of inscriptions, he saw characters that repeat over and over again. He guessed that this was the name Darius. He then tried to figure out how it might be, how the characters might be used to pronounce the name Darius. And then he was able to take some of those characters, fit them into other words in the ancient Persian inscription, see if they were similar to other Persian words that he knew, and then work backwards from there. Slowly over time, these philologists, or people who study ancient language, were able, once they got more and more documents, were able to decipher not only Old Persian, but eventually they were able to learn how cuneiform characters created sounds in these other languages like Akkadian. Lucky for us, ancient Mesopotamians actually created cuneiform dictionaries where they would have lists of words in different languages side by side. And when archaeologists found those, that was a real boon, obviously, to decipherment. Okay, that was about the 1830s. In the 1840s, the French and the English did a lot of excavations in what's now northern Iraq, looking for the remains of the ancient civilization of the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire, as I said before, is an empire that existed from about 900 BC to about 580 BC. It was a very powerful empire that where the kings and the Assyrians play a large role. in events mentioned in the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles, and also Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, there's a large section that talks about the siege of Jerusalem by the ancient Assyrians, and specifically the king Sennacherib. Now, a lot of these names, like Sennacherib and Sargon, were just names to a lot of Europeans, or Nineveh and Nimrud. They didn't actually know where these places were, and no one had actually excavated these sites. Now, Austin Layard was a diplomat, well, actually later became a diplomat, but he started out as an archaeologist, self-taught, again, like all the archaeologists at that time. He traveled to northern Iraq, which at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire, so it was northern Mesopotamia, part of the Ottoman territory, and talked to local people living in the area about tell sites and what tell sites might correspond to the ancient cities of Nineveh. And you read, about Nineveh, one of the ancient capital cities of the Assyrians, in Jonah. Jonah is told to go to Nineveh and to preach to the people. Now you can see this is obviously a tell. It's flat all around, and you have this large mound sticking up. So based on survey and based on using local people and local knowledge, he was able to identify several mounds as ancient Assyrian capital cities. And he excavated, they could have done a better job, honestly, but he excavated some of the palaces at Nimrud and also Nineveh. We're going to see some of his work later on in the semester and some of the other palace reliefs or palace carvings from these Assyrian capitals. But he found these very large stone sculptures, as you can see here, including some of my favorite Assyrian sculptures called Lamassu. These are these winged guardian figures that usually would guard the entrances to palaces. And they would typically have the bodies of lions or bulls, wings, and human heads. And you can see one here. As I'm going to point out, there's one in a museum in Chicago, in the University of Chicago at the Oriental Institute Museum. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And it weighs something like, it's 16 feet high, I believe, or maybe even a little bit higher. But you can see massive figures. When you read about cherubs in the Bible, these are what they're talking about. These are cherubs. Not the cute little babies with wings. That's the Renaissance. Cherubs in the ancient world were these kind of divine-like creatures that were comprised usually of, a winged animal with a human head. And they're guardian figures. They're supernatural guardian figures. Austin Layard dismantled some of these palace reliefs and transported them to the Tigris or the Euphrates, right? And here you can see he's transporting it by hand, just like the ancient Assyrians transported them originally, as they depicted on one of their stone reliefs. Put some of the monuments on rafts where they were sent downstream to Basra, which was a major port and still is in Mesopotamia on the Persian Gulf, and then put on a ship back to England. They're now in the British Museum. They caused quite a stir when they were first presented, and of course this was pretty revolutionary because Austin Layard was giving a face to the names of the empires in the Bible, right? And so this was a lot of the impetus for the early excavations in the Middle East. It was based on essentially what we knew from the Bible and trying to recreate some of these ancient empires. As more and more excavations took place, then archaeologists realized there were even older civilizations that were unknown to the biblical writers, that predated the Bible, like the Sumerians. Right? You can see here, this is Austin Layard when he finally got married. He was a late bloomer, I guess. This is his wife, And unfortunately for her wedding, he gave her all of these little seals, carved stone cylinders that were used to seal in ancient times. Right? An interesting aspect of Layard's work is that he helped train a local Iraqi and the Syrian Christian named Hormuz Rassam, who became basically the first, native Mesopotamian, native Iraqi-born archaeologist. In the 1850s, he ran excavations on his own. So, it's important to note that, from the beginning, there were Iraqis themselves or Syrians themselves who were also participating in excavation. He excavated some of the palace reliefs from an Assyrian king we'll talk about named Assurbanipal. A lot of the Assyrian kings have names that are hard to remember, as you'll see. But Assurbanipal is famous. His palace is famous for these scenes of lion hunting that you can see here. The French were doing a very similar thing to the English at the same time at a different Assyrian capital. They were working at a place called Khorsabad, which is the modern-day name. The ancient name was called Dir Sharukin, which means Fortress of Sargon. This was the capital city of another Assyrian king named Sargon. Many of these sculptures went to the Louvre, where they are today.